Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, once again, we step gently into the past, where the pages of history whisper of events so powerful, they reshape the very world we live in. Whether you're settling into bed or already nestled beneath the covers, I'm honored to have your company as we explore the quiet lessons of time. If you're new here, do feel free to subscribe for more sleepy stories like this one. Tonight we drift backward again, through veils of dust and parchment, iron and incense, to a time when men carried swords heavier than their futures and followed banners into deserts they could not pronounce. Whether you're curled beneath blankets or listening from a strangely reflective toilet seat, yes, even that one, I invite you to close your eyes and come with me. Imagine this isn't just any toilet. This is a magic toilet, a porcelain time portal, and when you flush, you vanish. Not down pipes, but through centuries. Suddenly, you're standing under a glaring sun, squinting across the Levant, your ankle deep in coarse sand. Behind you, there's the faint echo of flushing water, but ahead, only chaos. Cracked earth, sun-scorched steel, and the first crusade underway. It's the year 1096. You are hoping for a gentle historical stroll, but instead, welcome to hell on earth. A few months ago, back in France, you were told this would be glorious, that dying here would mean salvation, that God himself wanted you to join this war. Pope Urban II had stirred the embers of the Christian world with a fiery speech at Clermont, summoning knights, peasants, and even thieves to reclaim the Holy Land. But what he didn't mention was the menu. You're not even near Jerusalem yet. You're somewhere in Asia Minor, and you are hungry. Not missed lunch hungry. Bone-deep starvation. Your last meal was a sprig of wild rosemary and a questionable onion root. That was yesterday, or maybe the day before. Time blurs when your stomach growls louder than the marching drums. You glance around the camp. People are collapsing from hunger. Others are watching, quietly, calculating. You won't make it to Jerusalem. Not because of enemy arrows. Not because of some glorious death on the battlefield. No. You'll die in a small Syrian town called Ma'ara. The year is now 1098, and the Crusaders have just taken the city after a brutal siege.
The enemy has fallen, but the hunger hasn't. There's no food in the city, only corpses. And that's when it begins. Quiet at first. A whisper. A smell. You turn a corner and see two Crusaders crouched over something steaming. They're laughing, tearing flesh from bone. One of them looks up. "It's meat," he says plainly. "God won't mind." You retch, but you also hesitate, because you haven't eaten in days. These aren't monsters. These are men just like you, wearing crosses, quoting scripture, and barbecuing bodies. Chroniclers like Rodolphe of Caen and Albert of Aachen wrote about it. They saw it, and so did you. Some roasted limbs on spits, proudly. Others pickled body parts in vinegar to preserve them. A few skinned the dead, dried the flesh in the sun, and carried it like travel jerky. They didn't whisper. They boasted. This wasn't desperation, it was ritual. If you were Muslim, your chances were worse than zero. You weren't just the enemy, you were dinner, but even as a fellow Christian crusader, Your life was a thread in the wind. If your strength failed, your comrades would bury you in a shallow pit, or not at all. If you refused to eat with them, you'd starve. If you joined them, you'd never sleep soundly again. You came here thinking you were on a sacred mission. But no one prepared you for what holiness smells like after 3 weeks without food and a pile of roasting ribs beside a broken chapel. This was no knight's tale. This was survival, soaked in blood, and sanctified by papal blessing. The sun finally sets over Ma'ara. Ash drifts through the air like close snow. Somewhere nearby, someone is still chewing. You sit alone against the stone wall, the sky above you strangely beautiful. Your body is too tired to move, your mind too full of horror to think. You've survived your first 24 hours during the Crusades, but what remains of you is no longer the same. Thank you for joining this dark, quiet passage through history. I hope you're warm wherever you are, and that you'll never hear the sound of fire crackling over a human ribcage again. For those poor souls who imagine that dying from thirst or freezing rain would be the worst of their troubles, the realities of sea travel during the Crusades offered a fresh, saltwater-flavored nightmare. The Mediterranean, with its deceptively sparkling blues and sunlit horizons, held a deadly reputation among medieval travelers. Ships built during the High Middle Ages were often little more than oversized wooden coffins lashed together with tar, rope, and the eternal hope that St. Nicholas would keep them afloat. As noted in Anatomy of a Crusade, 1213, 1221, even seasoned sailors dreaded the frequent squalls that could erupt with almost no warning. These storms lashed the fragile Crusader vessels with walls of wind and waves, capsizing ships by the dozens. In one infamous voyage in 1227, an entire fleet attempting to join Frederick II's crusade was torn apart by a storm off the coast of Apulia. Hundreds drowned, their armor dragging them into the deep like stone weights. Those who survived faced sickness and starvation. Dysentery, scurvy, and contaminated food turned voyages into floating hells. Rats gnawed on hardtack rations, and salty air corroded every scrap of metal and hope. Those on board clung to prayer and vomit-stained railings, eyes peeled for any sign of land, even if that land was occupied by hostile forces. And then there was the threat of pirates. Saracen corsairs who patrolled the sea lanes in swift galleys, preying on supply ships and isolated troop transports. These maritime raiders showed little mercy, looting weapons and goods, and selling surviving crusaders into slavery in North African ports. Some captives disappeared forever into foreign markets. Others returned years later, broken and unrecognizable, bearing tales too painful to retell. But if a pilgrim was fortunate enough to make it to the Holy Land by ship, their trials had only begun. The transition from storm-battered decks to blistering deserts often meant trading seasickness for sunstroke, and crusty salt sores for oozing heat blisters. Dehydration loomed again as an old enemy, made worse by poor planning and the lack of native knowledge. Many European crusaders died not from wounds inflicted by enemy swords, but by ignorance of terrain, weather, flora, fauna, and the rhythms of a harsh land that cared little for righteous causes. And yet, amid this tapestry of sun-scorched agony, winter terror, and maritime despair, the crusading fervor endured. Driven by faith, ambition, and desperation, thousands continued to brave these trials. Their bones lie scattered from the coasts of Sicily to the dunes of Galilee, silent witnesses to human endurance and folly. So now, as you lay your head down and close your eyes, let your thoughts drift far from those sweltering battlefields and stormy seas. You're warm, you're safe, and not even the cruelest medieval winter can reach you here. Let the roar of Crusader storms fade into gentle rain. Let the blazing sun dim into soft candlelight. Beyond the battlefield and brutal climate, Crusaders had yet another enemy to face. The terrifying incompetence of medieval medicine. Medical care during the Crusades was a perilous gamble, equal parts superstition, butchery, and trial by ordeal. The average battlefield physician had limited formal training and even less understanding of infection. Many relied on Galenic theory, which posited that imbalances of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were the root of illness. The solution? Bloodletting, purging, or even forced vomiting, all of which left already weakened soldiers teetering on the edge of death. If you suffered from fever or inflammation, leeches might be applied, or a red-hot iron might be used to balance the fire within. Soldiers often feared their doctors more than their enemies, and rightly so. One disturbing report tells of a crusader with a broken skull who was treated by having a red-hot poker inserted into the wound to drive out the evil. He did not survive. Amputations were conducted without anesthetic, relying solely on alcohol or biting a strap of leather. The instruments, bone saws, knives, hooks were reused repeatedly without sterilization, making infection almost guaranteed. Surgeons often judged their success not by whether the patient lived, but by how cleanly they could remove a limb in a single stroke. And should the patient survive, the festering wounds might bring gangrene, tetanus, or death from septicemia. Meanwhile, pharmacists and healers were eyed with deep suspicion. A doctor preparing a medicinal draught might be accused of sorcery or poisoning, especially during paranoid waves like those under Conrad of Montferrat. In several known cases, physicians were hanged or beheaded simply for being seen mixing powders or heating herbs. But death by medicine wasn't always physical. Some poor souls were subject to exorcisms or trepanning, drilling holes in the skull to release demons or restore mental clarity. Unsurprisingly, this only served to reduce their chances of ever recovering. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, scurvy entered the scene. Though more famously associated with sailors, the disease plagued land-based crusaders who relied heavily on salted meat and grain during sieges. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare luxuries, and knowledge of vitamins was centuries away. Soldiers rotted from the inside out. Their gums bulged grotesquely. Their teeth fell out, their limbs swelled, and their joints stiffened until movement became impossible. Men who had survived brutal combat now whimpered in their tents, unable to walk or even speak. Some were found curled in corners, weeping as their bodies shut down. The stench of decay clung to their breath. Barbers, who often doubled as surgeons, used razors to cut away necrotic gum tissue in hopes of easing the pain. These cures did little but hasten the end. Even kings weren't spared. The once mighty Louis IX, patron of the Seventh Crusade, succumbed not in glory on the battlefield, but likely to the slow, painful decay of untreated scurvy. His canonization did little to mask the humiliating truth that even the noblest of warriors could be brought low by a lack of citrus. So tonight, as you settle beneath your cozy covers, Feel the comfort of your warm bed, the gentle hum of modern medicine in the background, and your fridge full of oranges, just a few steps away. The horrors of medieval wounds and gum rot are far, far behind you. Let history's agony drift into soft shadows, and may your dreams be free of red-hot pokers and leech-filled tents. Rest well, brave listener. If disease and human violence weren't enough to knock the life out of you during the Crusades, nature itself seemed determined to finish the job. Earthquakes, often seen in medieval times as divine punishment, or apocalyptic omens, struck Crusader territories with terrifying frequency. The Frankish kingdoms, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, and Jerusalem were all precariously built along the volatile Dead Sea transform fault. Medieval chroniclers, often more interested in signs from God than tectonic science, recorded these events with trembling pens and trembling souls. The earthquake of 1157, for instance, caused massive destruction in Syria and devastated the city of Hama. According to the chronicler William of Tyre, the tremors were so severe that the stones themselves moaned, and people were flung to the ground like dolls. In some places, entire buildings sank into the shifting soil, dragging their inhabitants into subterranean tombs. Survivors spoke of aftershocks lasting for days, leaving cities too frightened to sleep and too weakened to rebuild. Corpses were pulled from the rubble for weeks, their limbs twisted, their eyes still open in shock. But psychological effects of these disasters were just as profound as the physical ones. Many began to believe that these earthquakes were divine retribution, punishment for the sins of pride, broken oaths, or even the unholy slaughter of civilians. Panic spread faster than rational thought. People turned on one another. Accusations of heresy and secret pacts with the devil flared like wildfire. And even physicians and clerics were burned at the stake in the chaos that followed. In addition to the constant threat of seismic calamity, Crusaders had to contend with the less dramatic but no less devastating toll of day-to-day disease. Intestinal parasites like Giardia and Entamoeba histolytica were widespread, their cysts contaminating nearly every source of drinking water. Latrines were shallow holes shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds of men, and often dug too close to camps or rivers. This meant that a single defecation upstream could turn into an epidemic downstream. Medical understanding of germs was non-existent, and many believed illnesses like dysentery or trench fever were caused by bad air, divine wrath, or even demonic possession. One chronicle from the Fifth Crusade recounts soldiers experiencing such severe gastrointestinal distress that they tied themselves to trees to avoid collapsing into their own waste. Others stripped down and crawled into rivers for relief, only to die surrounded by the stench of death and the buzz of flies. And it wasn't just the sick who suffered. Caretakers, wives, monks, surgeons were exposed constantly. One account describes a priest who died after tending to a fevered soldier, only to have his own insides rot and pour out of him days later. The pace of death could become so rapid that corpses were stacked in churches, buried in shallow pits, or burned en masse outside camp walls. The buzz of insects, the stench of waste and blood, the groans of the dying, all of it became the soundtrack of crusading life. And still, the earth might tremble beneath your feet. It was an existence on the edge of fire, filth, and collapse. So as you lie in your soft, warm bed tonight, perhaps with a clean glass of filtered water nearby, and walls that do not shake or bleed, remember how lucky you are. The only quake you feel might be a distant thunder, and the only storm that visits you may live only in your dreams. Let the medieval moans fade with the breeze. You've walked through history's darkest shadows. Now it's time to rest. May your night be undisturbed by fire, fever, or falling stone. The Crusades didn't just spill blood across foreign lands. They spilled it at home, in the villages, courtrooms, and church halls of medieval Europe, where justice often resembled vengeance wrapped in religious garb. Before the Crusades even began, medieval law was already a grim theater of cruelty. Crimes that might today earn a fine or a prison sentence could back then result in the slow removal of your hands, your tongue, or your eyes. But the Crusades sharpened the blade of law. They didn't just reinforce brutality, they sanctified it. Violence was no longer just punishment, it was purification. After the First Crusade, the Latin Christian states in the Levant grew paranoid and volatile. Anything that threatened the fragile social fabric, from sexual orientation to incorrect theological opinions, was seen as a threat to God's dominion on earth. Punishments weren't meant just to control behavior. They were sermons in blood. Homosexuals, burned at the stake, weren't just victims. They were warnings to others, charcoal messages written on the wind. The shift extended beyond the Holy Land. Back in Europe, rulers grew emboldened. They legislated new levels of cruelty, often citing Crusader logic. If violence could protect the body of Christ abroad, then cruelty could protect the soul of the Europe at home. Jewish communities bore the brunt of this. After being scapegoated for everything, from coin clipping to crop failure, they were subjected to expulsion, forced conversion, public humiliation, and mass execution. Even Jewish children weren't spared. Many were forcibly baptized, then removed from their families for their own salvation. The logic of crusade became a blueprint for persecution. And that blueprint didn't just target outsiders. It folded inward, turning its gaze on Christians themselves. By the 13th century, the definition of a true Christian had grown narrower. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209, was not about reclaiming Holy Land. It was about cleansing heresy from within Christendom. The Cathars of southern France, with their dualist worldview and rejection of church hierarchy, were deemed more dangerous than Muslims or Jews. Why? Because they used the same holy texts, just differently. That alone, Crusader leaders said, made them traitors to truth. Entire cities were wiped out. In Béziers, as Catholic troops prepared to storm the walls, someone asked the papal legate how they should distinguish between heretic Cathars and loyal Catholics. The legate's infamous reply, Caedite eos, novit enim dominus qui sunt eius. Kill them all, God will know his own. Thousands were massacred indiscriminately. Fire did not discern between belief systems, and neither did steel. What began as a military expedition to the Holy Land mutated into a sprawling ideological war, one that turned every dissenting Christian into a potential enemy of the cross. The Fourth Crusade, perhaps the darkest twist in this spiral, didn't even make it to the Holy Land. Instead, it resulted in the brutal sack of Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city, the jewel of Eastern Orthodoxy, looted and burned by fellow Christians. Libraries were destroyed, churches desecrated, civilians killed, priests were murdered on the altar. The schism between Catholic West and Orthodox East, already cracking, now became an open wound that would never fully heal. By the end of the Crusades, Europe wasn't just bruised, it was transformed. Religious intolerance was no longer just a byproduct of war. It was institutionalized, codified, sanctified. Heresy hunting became a full-time job. Crusader laws echoed for centuries, shaping the laws of inquisitions, witch trials, and ideological purges that would follow. So as you drift off tonight, remember that the past isn't just swords and banners and distant battlefields. It is law codes soaked in fear, sacred texts wielded like weapons, and neighbors turned executioners. But those shadows are far behind you now. Your world is quieter, softer. No torches burn outside your window. No inquisitors knock at your door. You're safe. The only fires here are the ones inside your dreams. Warm, flickering, and free of fear. The Crusades were sold to the world as sacred pilgrimages, journeys of redemption and divine justice. But what so often unfolded was far more profane. Beneath the gleaming cross on a knight's shield, behind the papal seals and promises of absolution, there lurked something darker. Unchecked brutality, indiscriminate vengeance, and violence so chaotic and relentless that it no longer distinguished between sinner and saint, soldier and civilian, friend and enemy. The People's Crusade of 1096, driven not by trained armies, but by fervent mobs of peasants and zealots, unleashed its fury not on the Muslims of Jerusalem, but on the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. They never made it to the Holy Land, but they left a trail of blood across Europe. Entire Jewish families were dragged from their homes, tortured, and murdered in the streets. Some Jews, facing forced conversions or certain death, chose instead to end their lives and the lives of their children in desperate acts of martyrdom. These tragedies weren't the accidental chaos of war. They were targeted, systematic, and fueled by religious hate, masked as divine righteousness. But the Jews were not the only ones caught in the storm. Muslims, too, suffered unrelenting waves of carnage, both from crusaders and from rival Muslim factions. Intra-Muslim rivalries played out in parallel to the Christian campaigns, with Sunni rulers crushing Ismaili populations, often accusing them of subversion, sorcery, or treacherous assassinations. The Nizari Ismailis, who were feared and mythologized as the origin of the word assassin, became scapegoats for political violence. Entire cities were razed and thousands were killed, sometimes by the hands of their co-religionists, sometimes by foreign invaders. Even Christians weren't safe. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not just a tragic mistake. It was a turning point. Knights who had once pledged to protect their fellow Christians now tore through the Byzantine capital, looting priceless relics, burning ancient libraries, and defiling churches with their blood-stained boots. Nuns were raped in their convents. Monks were slaughtered before their altars. What began as a holy mission ended in sacrilege so profound that it stunned Europe. The Eastern and Western churches would never reconcile, the scars of betrayal written into stone and memory. Perhaps the most haunting part of these Crusader massacres was the utter lack of restraint. There was no battlefield etiquette, no sanctity for women or children, no refuge in holy places. When Jerusalem was taken in 1099, the bloodletting was so immense that, as chroniclers claimed, it reached the bridles of horses. Nights boasted of wading through limbs and entrails, of piling heads like trophies. Jews seeking sanctuary in their synagogues were burned alive within them. Muslim defenders were hacked down in the alleys or hurled from rooftops. And when the smoke cleared, the victors prayed over the ruins they had made. The Crusades, for all their religious fervor, revealed the worst of human nature when cloaked in divine approval. When men believe their violence is blessed by heaven, they can justify any horror. In that way, the Crusades were less about salvation and more about sanction, the kind that erases moral limits, allowing murderers to sleep at night under the illusion that they've done something holy. But you, dear listener, don't need to carry these horrors into your sleep. You've walked long enough through the shadows of the past. The torches have gone out, the swords are sheathed, and the cries of war are far behind you now. Let the dust settle. Let the silence return. There's nothing left to fear here, only a quiet rustle of history folding itself into the night. So close your eyes, gentle traveler of time. The cities have calmed, the fires have cooled, and the ghosts have laid down their swords. Drift softly now, far from crusades and kings and chaos. You are safe. You are warm. And the only thing waiting for you now is peace. Good night.